thought for the day. The goal is progress, not perfection.
Welcome to 7 Minutes for Yourself. I'm Christina Aina, and I'm so glad you've joined me for what I believe will be 7 of the most enriching minutes of your day. Let's take this time to reconnect with ourselves and improve our well-being.
In today's episode of 7 Minutes for Yourself, we discuss some tips and tricks on moving away from impossible standards of perfectionism and embracing the self-development that comes from being imperfect. Have a listen.
I do want to say that perfectionism isn't all bad. In fact, many psychologists will separate perfectionism into 2 different categories: adaptive and maladaptive. Adaptive perfectionists are motivated by their high standards. They pursue their goals without compromising their self-esteem, they're not hypercritical of their work or themselves, and they invest massive amounts of time and energy into projects that require a lot of attention and focus and effort. Maladaptive perfectionists, on the other hand, feel constant pressure to meet an unrealistic standard. They procrastinate because things are so hard to get into, they feel a lot of anxiety and sometimes even depression because they're holding themselves to an ideal they can't possibly reach. Now, I don't believe that these are 2 binary states. There's certainly a spectrum between perfectionism to the adaptive and maladaptive sorts. And for you, perfectionism probably has some benefits, but it probably also brings along some problems. And personally, the main problems I see with perfectionism are, number 1, it makes tasks seem monumental because you want to do perfectly on them, so you procrastinate. Number 2, constant tweaking and editing will cause you to never actually publish and put things out there and move on because you're always second guessing your previous decisions. Number 3, your skill development is hampered because you aren't allowing yourself to make mistakes, which are absolutely critical to the learning process. And lastly, you have a lot of anxiety and stress because you're holding yourself to an unrealistic ideal and you're constantly worried about your work being judged. So, how do you overcome perfectionism? Well, number 1, you need to realize that you're not perfect, and neither is anybody else. And I realize the second half of that statement can be really hard to acknowledge sometimes because the internet is always presenting us with things that are finished and polished. Like, we have so many connections to so many people, and they're all presenting a tailored version of themselves to you. They're so proud to show off the fruits of their labors, but they never show off the hours that went into it. And they never show off the mistakes and the failures that they had along the way. And these are vital parts of the learning process. You can't have success without these mistakes. So embrace imperfection. Embrace mistakes. Realize it's going to happen. Like, think back to when you were a kid and you were learning to ride a bike. You probably fell off a ton of times. You probably still have scars on your shoulders that remind you of those times. And you weren't worried at all about riding the bike perfectly the first time. You just wanted to ride the bike. You probably wanted to get the training wheels off. And you tried and tried and tried until you did it. If it took so many tries to learn to do something as simple as riding a bike, why do you think you have to be able to write a paper or give a speech perfectly on the first try? Number 2, just get started and let your work become a mess. Work in private and don't worry about the state of the project on the first pass-through. In his memoir On Writing, Stephen King advises to write with the door closed and rewrite with the door open. Don't worry about the state of your project during its first stage. Just get it created in its rough initial form and then invite feedback and constructive criticism once you're ready to start shaping the prototype into something that's truly worthy of being finished. Number 3, work with a deadline. Now, this is the practice that's helped me overcome my perfectionism the most. And because of that, I had this excellent taste, right? But I realized that I was a beginner, and if I wanted to meet that ideal standard with my videos, I would never be able to do that, and I would never put anything out there. So instead, I told myself, I'm going to put out a video every single week. And I remember after I released my first video, I was having a conversation with my friend Matt, and I told him, a year from now, I want to have at least 50 videos out. And putting those videos out every single week, as imperfect as they may be, has helped me progress a lot. Now, I realize that some people will say that creating deadlines and forcing yourself to put things out there at an arbitrary time isn't necessary, and indeed, you need time to meander through a project and try things and work at your own pace. And if that works for you, if you believe that, that's fine. But remember that there are differences between adaptive and maladaptive perfectionism. If your perfectionism is causing you anxiety and stress, then I think it's a really good idea to create that deadline and force yourself to finish. You need a structure that forces you not to focus on the minutia of one project for too long. Number 4, focus on getting just a little bit better each time. If you improve 1% each time you make something, then over time that progress compounds, and before you know it, you've mastered whatever it is you're learning. Creating things, putting them out there, and having the imperfections and mistakes pointed out, these are all parts of the learning process that have to happen. Skill and knowledge come through countless iterations, not through executing perfectly on the first iteration. The skill that you gain through making the first 9 things will allow you to hone the 10th one to a degree you didn't even know was possible when you were making the first one. And lastly, let your influences inspire you, but don't measure yourself up against them. A beginner shouldn't measure their work against that of a master's. If you were to start a YouTube channel tomorrow and you put out your first video, you shouldn't compare it against somebody else's 500th video. That's not a fair comparison. The only thing you should measure your work against is your previous work. And when you're looking at things other people have made, you can let them inspire you, you can let them influence you and motivate you to improve, but don't hold your work up against theirs and judge yourself based on that standard.
That concludes today's episode of 7 Minutes for Yourself. Please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts. Today and every day with your kiddo is a gift. Enjoy it. Thanks for tuning in.